What the practice does, it helps you to feel better, helps you to think different. If you think different,
The house by the lake in Küsnacht, Switzerland, was completely still. No music, no cameras, no final public appearance. In the last 14 days of her life, Tina Turner, a woman who once shook stadiums with her voice and presence, disappeared entirely from the public world. It is a contradiction that feels almost impossible to accept. This was a woman who screamed her pain into microphones, who turned trauma into testimony, who let millions witness her survival in real time. And yet, 2 weeks before her death, there was no message, no farewell, no last confession. Fans waited for what history had trained them to expect. A final statement, a closing reflection, a truth she had saved for the end. Nothing came. Her silence was not accidental, it was complete. And it raised a question more unsettling than any revelation could have. Why would the ultimate symbol of resilience, someone who survived abuse, illness, and abandonment, choose absolute silence at the final moment? This is not a story about scandal. There is no hidden tape, no shocking last-minute secret. Only the cold, controlled reality of 14 final days, and a woman who, after a lifetime of being watched, chose to leave the world without saying another word. In early May 2023, something quietly changed. There were no headlines announcing it, no official statement, no warning signs for the public to grasp onto. Tina Turner simply stopped appearing. There were no interviews scheduled, no social media messages posted, no personal updates released through representatives. For a woman whose entire career had been built on expression, this absence felt unnatural. For decades, Tina Turner had used every available medium to speak for herself. Music became her testimony. Her autobiography became her confrontation with the past. The stage became the place where pain was transformed into power. When she had something to say, the world heard it loudly. But in these final 14 days, every channel went silent. The media noticed, but cautiously. European and American outlets began revisiting her well-documented health struggles. Kidney failure, a stroke, cancer, years of physical strain. Yet there was no confirmation of a critical condition. No breaking news. No language of urgency. This uncertainty split public perception into two competing narratives. One side believed nothing was wrong. Tina Turner had stepped away from the spotlight years earlier, choosing privacy in Switzerland. To them, this was simply another quiet chapter in a life she had already closed publicly. The other side sensed something final. They saw the complete withdrawal not as coincidence, but as preparation. A deliberate retreat, a woman slowly closing every door to the outside world. What made the moment unsettling was not what was known, but what wasn't. There was no evidence to confirm either interpretation, no visible decline, no farewell, only an expanding silence. And with each passing day, that silence grew heavier, transforming from absence into presence, a void where information should have been, and where certainty never arrived until it was already too late. In the final days of her life, Tina Turner made a choice that unsettled even those who believed they understood her best. She did not update the public on her health. She did not release a farewell to fans. She did not offer a closing reflection on a career that had defined entire generations. There was no final note to the people who had followed her for more than 60 years. No retrospective message. No thank you or goodbye. For most artists, this absence would feel incomplete. For Tina Turner, it felt deliberate. To understand why, her silence must be placed against the weight of everything she had already said. Tina was never a guarded figure when it came to truth. She had publicly confronted domestic abuse at a time when silence was expected of women. She detailed violence, fear, and survival in her autobiography. She stood on stages night after night, transforming private trauma into a collective release. Pain was never hidden. It was reshaped, amplified, and given meaning. Her entire legacy was built on expression. That is what makes the final silence so psychologically striking. When she had the strength, Tina spoke fully. When she had control, she told everything. But when time began to narrow, she stopped adding to the narrative. There are several ways to interpret this decision, none of them simple. One possibility is control. Tina Turner spent much of her life fighting to reclaim ownership of her name, her body, her career, her story. By refusing to speak at the end, she may have been asserting that control one last time. The final image would not be shaped by headlines, interviews, or emotional soundbites. It would remain undefined. Another interpretation is dignity. Tina had survived enough to know how easily suffering can be consumed. Public illness often becomes spectacle. Final messages are dissected, repackaged, monetized. By saying nothing, she denied the world another moment of access. There is also the possibility of exhaustion, not physical alone, but narrative exhaustion. Tina Turner had already given the world her truth in full. She had revisited her pain, her triumphs, her losses, again and again. There was nothing left that required explanation. Her silence, then, was not emptiness. It was completion. In this context, the absence of a farewell becomes its own statement. I have already told you who I am. I do not need to repeat it at the end. Silence did not mean there was nothing left to say. It meant everything that mattered had already been said over a lifetime lived in full view, and finally, withdrawn by choice. In the final 2 weeks of her life, the world of Tina Turner narrowed to a single place. Her home in Switzerland became the boundary of everything that remained. There were no public visits, no gatherings of extended family, no famous friends arriving for one last goodbye. The noise that had followed her for decades, press, audiences, applause, never crossed the threshold. What remained was privacy, uninterrupted and absolute. This was not the ending many imagined for a global icon. Tina Turner's life had unfolded on stages built for tens of thousands. She had lived under lights so bright they erased shadows. Her presence once demanded space, physical, emotional, cultural. Now, space was reduced. At the center of this final world was Erwin Bach. He was not a celebrity partner performing grief for cameras. He did not speak publicly in those days. He did not frame the moment. Instead, he occupied 3 roles quietly and completely: husband, caregiver, witness. Their relationship had long been defined by withdrawal from spectacle. Switzerland was not an escape, it was a choice. In those last days, that choice became absolute. Erwin Bach was the only constant presence, the final human connection in a life that once belonged to millions. The contrast is difficult to ignore. There was a time when Tina Turner's voice traveled farther than her body, when crowds surged toward her, when she stood alone at center stage, commanding an entire arena. And now, there was only a room. Only 2 people, no audience left to impress. This contrast is not tragic in the traditional sense. There was no public collapse, no dramatic final scene, no spectacle of suffering. What unfolded instead was something quieter and perhaps more unsettling. The title, Queen of Rock and Roll, had no function here. It did not protect her. It did not follow her into the private space of illness, age, and human limitation. In that room, titles dissolved. What remained was a woman whose body had endured decades of intensity, and a man who stayed. This reduction from legend to person was not accidental. It reflected a long arc in Tina Turner's life. A gradual movement away from performance, away from public validation, toward something smaller and controlled. There was no loud tragedy because none was needed. The drama had already been lived. What remained was the natural contraction of a life reaching its final boundary. In the end, the world did not collapse around Tina Turner. It simply grew smaller, until it fit inside a private space she had chosen long before the final days arrived. It was only after her death that the full weight of the final 14 days became clear. When Tina Turner passed away, the public instinctively looked backward, searching for missed signs, hidden meanings, unspoken clues. And what emerged was not chaos, but order. Everything had already been arranged. There was no unfinished narrative waiting to be resolved, no loose thread demanding explanation, no emotional eruption delayed until the final moment. The absence itself was the message. There was no last confession, no shocking revelation released to headlines, no family conflict spilling into public view. In a media culture trained to expect spectacle at the end of a legend's life, this restraint felt almost unsettling. The world searched for drama and found none. Instead, it found intention. What Tina Turner left behind was not silence born of weakness, but silence shaped by choice. After decades of having her body, voice, and history consumed by the public, she refused to let her final chapter become another performance. There would be no farewell tour of emotion, no carefully staged goodbye, no final monetization of suffering. What remained was control. This was not the first time Tina Turner had taken control of her own disappearance. She had walked away before leaving an abusive marriage, abandoning a collapsed career, restarting from zero when the industry had written her off. Each time, survival required decisive withdrawal before reemergence. But this time, there was no return planned. The real shock of her final days lies not in what happened, but in what did not. She did not attempt to reclaim the spotlight one last time. She did not seek narrative closure through public validation. She allowed her story to end without punctuation. In doing so, Tina Turner challenged one of the most deeply embedded expectations placed on icons, that they must explain themselves until the very end, that their deaths must be accompanied by meaning packaged for consumption. Instead, she offered something rarer: stillness, silence, completion. This reframes her legacy in an unexpected way. For decades, Tina Turner was celebrated for her comeback, for rising again when survival seemed impossible. But perhaps her final victory was not another return. Perhaps it was the refusal to return at all, the right to step away, the right to disappear without apology, the right to let the story stand as it was already told. There is no moral lesson forced upon this ending, no instruction for how to interpret it. Tina Turner did not ask to be understood one last time. She simply withdrew. And in that withdrawal, she left behind a final legacy not defined by sound or spectacle, but by restraint. Silence, in the end, was not an absence of meaning. It was meaning without explanation.